Hello, and thank you so much for inviting us to present at the Detroit Negro League Centennial Symposium. My name is Heidi Jacobs, and I'm a librarian at the University of Windsor, and I'm presenting work that my research partner, Miriam Wright, also from the University of Windsor, but from the history department, and I've been working on for about 5 years now. We're excited to be here, albeit virtually, to talk to you about work we've done and are doing on the Chatham College All-Stars, as well as some of our research into the connections between Windsor and Detroit Black baseball. We'll show you some of the results of our early work and talk about some of the newer work we're doing right now. In the spirit of scholarly sharing, at the end of the presentation, we'll conclude with a few questions that we have. Perhaps some of you might have some information for us, and we'll give you our contact information in case we have information that you would like. If you haven't heard of the 1934 Chatham College All-Stars, they were the first Black team to win an Ontario Baseball Amateur Association championship. Until very recently, the story of this team was not well known outside of Chatham. The All-Stars were a team from the East End neighborhood where the majority of the city's Black population lived, and this was about 400 people. Although Canada did not have the explicit and formalized segregation we see in the US around this time, it certainly had entrenched segregationist practices in many aspects of society, including sports. The existence of these discriminatory practices would explain the number of Black baseball teams across Canada in the late part of the 19th century and the first part of the 20th century, and some of the racist and discriminatory acts the team encountered. The story of the 1934 Chatham College All-Stars is not just a baseball story. It is a story that must be considered within the broader social context of race and sport in Canada. The more we've learned about this team, the more we believe that their stories can change what we know about race and sports in Canada. And as we shall suggest today, the story of this team can also help us explore the fluid border of Black baseball in this region. Miriam and I first became familiar with the All-Stars when Mrs. Pat Harding showed us 3 large scrapbooks documenting the fascinating story of her father-in-law, Wilford Boomer Harding. Mr. Harding led a fascinating life, and we won't be able to get into it here today, but these scrapbooks introduced us to the Chatham College All-Stars, sparking for both of us a major research endeavor we're still working on. Our first iteration of what we've come to call the Harding Project was to collaborate with the Harding family, the Chatham Kent Sports Hall of Fame, and the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society to develop a series of public history deliverables to reach everyone from school children to community members, from K-12 teachers to university researchers. Most of these deliverables are available through our Breaking the Color Barrier website, which we invite you to explore at your leisure. The 2 major components of this project were to collect and preserve and share the documentation of the Chatham College All-Stars, primarily through newspaper and other printed materials, but also to conduct oral histories with the descendants and friends of the team members. Underpinning the whole project is an understanding that memory, whether material or personal, is extremely fragile and imperiled. Our project is motivated by a desire to preserve these memories for future generations and to share them widely and broadly. We also developed a number of ways to spread the story of the Chatham College All-Stars, including some baseball cards, a traveling exhibit, school curriculum for grades 1 through 12, and most recently, a comic book by award-winning cartoonist Scott Chandler. Recently, we've been approached by Wilfrid Laurier University Press to write a book about the 1934 All-Stars, so we've been working on that over the past year and a half. And we've collected more material and expanded our scope to include a wider context. And one of the contexts we've been exploring and would like to share with you today is the research we've been doing about Windsor, which took us to Detroit, which took us back to Chatham. There is a strange and eerie irony about talking to you today about the fluidity of the border between Windsor and Detroit when this border has been closed since March and shows no sign of reopening. Like many people in Windsor, my own baseball story in this region has been built upon crossing the Detroit River dozens and dozens of times every summer to watch baseball. Indeed, this fluid, nearly invisible border is precisely how Black baseball players seem to view the Detroit River, which was crossable in the 1930s by ferry, bridge, and tunnel. Another strange irony about the border in this context is while the players and communities in the Negro Leagues era seem to view the Canada-US border as fluid, much of the historical research into that era seems to stop at the Canadian border, sort of like this weather map. Today's presentation is, we hope, a way of opening up that border again to its earlier fluidity, if only in a scholarly sense. Our work at this point is still fairly preliminary and focused on the Chatham College All-Stars connections with Windsor and Detroit, but we'd like to share some of what got us thinking about that conversation. Just to get the geography in your minds, here's a map with Windsor, Detroit, and Chatham marked. Chatham is about 60 miles away from the Windsor-Detroit border, and there were, and still are, strong family ties among these communities, and many Black families had relatives on both sides of the border. As you can see from the map, Windsor and Detroit are far enough away from Chatham that there wasn't continual movement between the centers in the 1930s, but they were still close enough that Black baseball players knew each other, or at least knew of each other, especially who the really strong players were. Because of the economic precarity of the 1930s, we had players willing and able to move between communities in search of opportunities for employment or in search of new beginnings through baseball, as was the case for several of the Chatham College All-Stars. Our research into this team has revealed that we have four main players from the Chatham College All-Stars who embody this Windsor, Detroit, Chatham movement. And each of these four players' histories reveals a number of things about the relationships between these three centers and about Black baseball in this region in the 1930s. These four players are Ferguson Jenkins and Flat Chase from Windsor, and Don Tabron and Donnice Washington from Detroit. So let's start with the Windsor players, Flat Chase and Ferguson Jenkins. And if you're wondering if there's any relationship between this Ferguson Jenkins and the Hall of Famer Fergie Jenkins Jr., this is his father. Now, Flat Chase and Ferguson Jenkins both lived around Mercer Street in Windsor's historically Black neighborhood. Just off Mercer was, and still is, Weigel Park, which was a vital space for community building within Windsor's Black community. Weigel Park offered a number of attractions, but its baseball diamond is particularly significant. Earl Flat Chase, perhaps the most legendary All-Star, spent his early years living across the street from this ballpark. All of his spare hours were spent there honing the pitching, hitting, and fielding skills that would bring him renown later on. Also living in the Mercer Street area was Ferguson Jenkins, and our research into local newspapers of the time shows that Ferguson Jenkins and Flat Chase's names are often on the rosters for various Black teams in the Windsor area. It was also likely at this diamond at Weigel Park where Boomer Harding and his brother Len first met Flat Chase, and where Len Harding went to look for Chase when the All-Stars needed, as Boomer Harding called it, quote, a little reinforcement. In an interview in 1977, Boomer recollected that Len, quote, went to Windsor and Fergie Sr. was there, playing good ball in Essex County leagues. Work was kind of scarce in the Windsor district, so this is how we got most of his players, he said. In the 1934 season, Fergie Jenkins Sr. would come and go on the box course with the Chatham College All-Stars, depending on what work was available and where. By 1935, he became more of a fixture in the lineup, and he would live in Chatham for the rest of his life. In 1934, Chase moved permanently to Chatham, and Chase's passion for baseball is mentioned in every single interview we have done or read with members of the Chase family. As his son Horace Chase recalled, quote, to tell you the truth, his love of the game was phenomenal because that was his sport. In fact, when all three of us children were born, he wasn't there for the birth. He was playing baseball. That's how much he played. Chase's skills and lifelong passion for the game appear to have led him to seek out opportunities to play in Detroit as a teenager, and we have stories of him at age 15 playing for teams such as the Second Baptist Church and the Detroit Church League champs. Chase's connections with the Detroit Church League baseball and other teams is likely what connected him with Detroit players Don Tabron and Don Washington. Just as Len Harding went to Windsor to recruit Chase and Jenkins, Len Harding and Ben Talbot went to Detroit to get a few extra players for an exhibition game on the Victoria Day holiday long weekend. In 1984, Talbot recalls that, quote, Flat said he knew a guy in Detroit that he played with a church league. So Len Harding and I went over to Detroit looking for this guy. Flat said the guy was a good fielder but couldn't hit a bull in the behind with a shotgun. Len and I went over and we looked in every pool hall on the east side. We finally found our shortstop at about 2 a.m. The shortstop they found was Don Tabron, who brought along catcher Don Washington, players from the Black Bottom neighborhood in Detroit. Both Tabron and Washington would play for Chatham for most, if not all, of the 1934 season. Washington would play a few more seasons in Ontario and then return to Detroit later in the 1930s. And we've been able to connect with and interview Don Tabron's son, Donald, but we have not been able to connect with descendants of Denise or Don Washington. According to an interview with Boomer Harding, Denise Washington owned a tavern on the east side of Detroit, but that is all we know about him after he left Ontario. But to return to Weigel Park, we see its importance to our Chatham College All-Stars story because it was a training ground and a meeting space. But Weigel Park was also important to the larger story of Black baseball in the Windsor, Detroit area. And we've been extremely fortunate to have a local historical researcher, the indefatigable Linda Bunn, scour a decade or more of Essex County newspapers for mentions of Black baseball on our behalf. And her meticulous research revealed that Weigel Park was the site of many cross-border baseball games between Black Canadian and US teams in the 1930s, and probably earlier and later than that too. The clippings she assembled from the Windsor newspapers show a fluid border and frequent visits from Black teams from the US throughout the 1930s, including teams like the Saginaw, Michigan Colored Baseballers, the Ecorse Colored Giants, the Hamtramck Colored Stars, Philadelphia Colored Stars, Wolverine Colored Stars, Quinn's Colored Stars of Detroit, and the Detroit Colored Stars, among others. Again, for scope and perspective, you can see on this map how close Weigel Park and Hamtramck are, and this map helps put some of that cross-border play into perspective. Although we don't have a lot of box scores or lineups, the write-ups we do have suggest that these games were no small affair. During the August-long weekend, a reported 2,000 fans came to watch the Detroit Colored Stars play in Weigel Park as part of the Emancipation Day celebrations. Emancipation Day, which has lately been getting much more attention, commemorated the end of slavery in the British Empire and was celebrated by Black people in Canada since the 19th century. These events were hugely popular and featured a wide range of events and activities. And then in the 1930s, we see Emancipation Day events throughout the Windsor, Essex, Chatham, Kent area, having exhibition games between Black teams from Ontario and from Detroit. Baseball stories in the sports pages of the Windsor paper, as well as the Chatham Daily News, document the interchanges between Canada and US Black baseball teams. And these newspapers might add some new dimensions to what is known about Black teams in Detroit, as well as the broader region. For example, we have a fair bit of coverage about a team called the Taylor's Colored Stars of Detroit because they played 3 exhibition games against the Chatham Colored All-Stars in 1934. The Chatham Daily News sports writer Jack Calder offers this summary of the Detroit team, who are fairly equally matched with the strong Chatham team. Calder writes, "When it is considered that the Detroit Nine was picked from the 180,000 colored residents of Detroit, where baseball is going better than ever this year, Chatham fans must realize that the Chatham Colored All-Stars are a pretty nifty team." And these games were also a huge draw for the fans. One conservative estimate for the August doubleheader was 1,400 fans. Again, these are details that help us to better understand the cross-border baseball culture of the 1930s. It has proved difficult for us to track down the US teams mentioned in the local papers in any formal documents, rosters, or newspapers, though we do have a bit more information about the Taylor Stars of Detroit. We know, for example, that a Lawrence lefty, Terrell, played for Detroit in 1934 doubleheader, and it's quite likely that this is the same lefty Terrell who played for the Detroit Stars in the Negro Leagues in the 1924 and 1925 seasons. We also have players listed with the last names of Turner, Denard, and Catchings. And we also have a box score from August 1935 that lists the whole lineup. All of our research into who the Taylor is in the Taylor's All-Stars of Detroit from 1934 hasn't yielded much, although Gary Gillette has recently helped me realize that the Taylor is likely not Candy Jim Taylor. It is highly probable that these teams playing in Windsor and Chatham were not part of the formal Negro League system, but it would seem logical that there would have been crossover players. More than likely, these teams were informally organized pickup teams playing exhibition games for a cut of the gate. And while there isn't much to work with, the mention of these teams in the Windsor papers might help other researchers to further what is known about the Black baseball in the Detroit area in the 1930s. And this research can help put sources of information about Black baseball on both sides of the Detroit River more fully in dialogue with each other. When we interviewed Don Tabron Jr., son of player Don Tabron and a resident of Detroit, Donald reflected on the story of the Chatham College All-Stars and the rich yet undocumented history of cross-border baseball in Windsor and Detroit. He said, quote, "Even though we're close, it's a country away. There's not much awareness of that particular story. Most people here have heard of the Detroit Brown Bombers. Most of the people here have heard at least of the Detroit Stars. But those teams came into their prowess maybe 10, 12 years after the All-Stars won their provincial championship. But there's not enough recognition or even knowledge of the story of the Chatham Stars, even though locally there were at least a couple of guys from Detroit that made a pretty good impact on that team." We agree with Donald that there needs to be more awareness about this story on both sides of the river, and we are hopeful that this presentation will help us to start to think about the border as more fluid and open as we continue our collective explorations of Black baseball in Canada and Negro Leagues baseball in the US. In the spirit of shared exploration and pooling collective knowledge, we'll toss these questions out in case one of you might have some leads for us. We're specifically looking for information about Donis or Don Washington and the Taylor's College Stars of Detroit from 1934. Any mentions of Earl Flat Chase playing in Detroit or any information about the Black church leagues in Detroit would also be welcome. And finally, we'd like to thank you again for this opportunity to cross the border, if only virtually, to think about baseball with you. If you have questions or comments, we can be mailed at hardingproject@uwindsor.ca, and we're also on Twitter at Boomer Harding. If you're interested in any of the baseball cards or comics or any other cool Chatham College All-Stars merchandise that we have, they can be purchased through the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society, and all proceeds from the sale of this merchandise goes to support the important community and historical work done by the Chatham Kent Black Historical Society. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you soon.